Thanks everyone for attending. Um, so we're here today to talk about why you should be using the Autodesk Vault Professional Item Master. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know why it's a good idea to use items, right? So things like them giving you a part number-centric workflow, letting you bridge the gap between CAD data um, and the way the rest of the business communicates about parts. It gives you more data for organization. Items let you build BOMs more effectively, and items give you better options for integration. So these are hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you will agree with me. I hope that items give you all of these benefits. So to try to make that point, here's our agenda for the presentation. I'm going to start with an overview of items and how they work or their general purpose. For any of you that might be attending who aren't familiar with the Vault Item Master and its functionality. We'll talk briefly about how, if you're using Vault today but you're not using the Item Master, how you might make the transition from your current Vault behaviors, very commonly, say, file life cycles with revisions, to using the Item Master. And then we'll talk about, again, why you should do it. Is it worth making that transition? Why you should be using items? And then we'll finish up with a sort of a discussion about why items or how items make it easier to integrate with PLM and ERP and other business systems, right? So let's talk about the Vault Item Master, right? So just a very brief high-level overview. An item is a type of record in Vault Professional. So if you're not familiar with the Item Master, in some cases, depending on, if you're a Vault user, depending how your environment is set up, you may not even be able to see the Item Master as an option to use. It might be hidden. It's an administrative option, right? So, but I would say most of the companies that I've worked with over the years are not using the Vault Item Master. There's very file centric. And so while you may be used to, file records in the Vault, a record that directly represents a file, an item is just another record type in the Vault that has its own behaviors that can be associated with file records, but they are distinct records, right? Now, these items, they may or may not be linked to files, and items can be related to each other, much like a file can have a parent or have a child. An item can have a parent or a child, right? You can have a hierarchical relationship of item records. And their fundamental purpose is to represent a part number, right? And they're typically used to capture bill of materials information, right, using that parent-child relationship. But they're also used to collect multiple different file records that might be related to the same part number. So with that brief description, I'd like to provide to show our first poll question of the day, because I would like to get a sense of the audience here and how many of you are currently using the Vault Item Master in some way, right? So you should, the poll should be have appeared to you, or should appear shortly. And if you could just take a minute to answer that question, that'll also help me understand where the audience is and how many of you have any experience with this. Because again, Vault items are typically used to capture bill of material relationships, but they can be used for really any purpose where you need a single record that can be clearly linked to other records, like file records specifically, but also hierarchical relationships again. So I've seen items used in lots of different ways over the years. All right, so it looks like we've got almost all of the votes in. 3/4 of you have voted. I really appreciate that. And this is actually maybe a little bit lower than I expected. Um, I've heard, I haven't seen hard data, but roughly 20 to 30%, and maybe this is globally, of Vault users or companies that are using Vault use the item master. But in our audience today, it's only about 16%. So the vast majority of you are definitely not using the Vault item master. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll get a better sense of, the benefits you could reap from using the item master, and help make a decision if it makes sense for you to transition to something like items. So when we're talking about items, and let's get into a little bit more detail about what items are. Let's say we start with this is an inventor assembly, right? So it's got a few pieces to it. And let's say, this is what I've drawn in Inventor. And that's great. I've got some shapes on a screen, right? But this ultimately has a part number in the rest of our organization. If this is something that we make, we are creating this, we probably have given it a number, a part number, right? And, we've got an inventor assembly document for it, but that's not the only way that the information about this part number is captured, or that's not the only artifact in our environment, at least from a file perspective, that describes this thing that we make, right? We may have a step file of it to be used in another assembly or to provide to a customer or a vendor for quoting purposes, right? We may have DXF files of individual pieces for machining purposes, or, if you've got sheet metal. If we're machining this on like a CNC, there's going to be a file that captures, the machine code, ideally. And especially things like NC files, if you're keeping revisions of the model, ideally you would want to keep revisions of the code necessary to have it cut on a machine, right? We've got typically a drawing of this. There might be a PDF of that drawing. There might be work instructions for how, to put it into a machine. There might be assembly instructions. There might be a quality inspection plan. So we have all of these documents, in our environment floating around that really describe this part number. But they're never really that well organized, right? They're never all neatly lined up in one place. We've got the models in Vault, the drawings in Vault, a step file over here on a share, the NC files on a computer in the shop. These documents are scattered in SharePoint or a Teams folder or somebody's computer, right? And so this is where the Vault Item Master can really be a huge benefit for not only engineering, but really the rest of the organization. Because you can take an item, it becomes a bucket, essentially a container, with that part number, and all of these different files that might be floating around the organization, they can all go in one spot, well organized, other than, despite what you see here on the screen. And I can go to one place to find all of the information about this item, this part number, right? So in addition to those file relationships, we can also relate items to each other, right? An item can be a parent and it can have a child, and those children can have children, right? So this is how you can develop a bill of materials structure, right? It's different than, say, a file attachment. File attachments, if you're attaching one file to another, technically there is directionality there. One is the parent and one is the child, but it's not quite as obvious because that information is only available like on the uses and where used tabs of the file. An item in Vault Professional has a bill of materials, and it has children, and it is used in other places, right? But even these file relationships, how we've got everything, all of these various files linked to a part number, not all of these files are equally important, right? The, the CAD file really is the primary digital representation of this. It has, I would say, generally the most accurate information, right? Um, And so items, when they are linked to files, there are actually different possible types of links, right? We have a primary link that would say typically would link to the CAD model and a specific link type for drawings. But then when it comes to things like standard components or virtual components or model states, which we'll get into in a little bit, um, you can very carefully control how a file is associated to an item. And you can even have attachments. So like things like Word documents would typically be attachments. And one very interesting thing about that is you can actually link a file to an item and pin that version. So even if the file that it is attached to changes, it versions up, the attachment can always point to, for the item, can always point to a specific version of that file. In addition to all the other, behaviors, right, that items can have. So life cycles and properties, Vault items can behave essentially just like files, just about, in terms of life cycle behaviors. There's some minor differences, but mostly when you get into things like creating PDFs and step files automatically with the job processor. But in terms of, can the record have a status or a state? Can it go through transitions? Can you control access to the record based on the state? Items behave just like files. And file items can lock the files that they are linked to, depending on the link type. So the primary linked file, say the CAD file that is related to the item, it can become locked for edit, so people can't check it out when the item becomes locked. So it's a way for you to control access to the files. And in fact, items have been around in Vault Professional for many years, at least 15 as far as I know, maybe even longer. And before file life cycles even existed in Vault, items were there and they had life cycles, and that's how you might control access to files way back in, say, product stream, if any of you have been using Vault for a really long time. So again, items have life cycles. They also have their own set of properties. So they are distinct from any properties that are of linked files, right? So the item can have its own set of properties, but they can be mapped to the file properties. So what this lets you do is you can take properties that are owned by CAD, by the people that create the CAD files. Those properties can be carried forward to the item record. But you can have other properties that are owned by something outside of CAD that maybe have no bearing on the information in CAD, but can still be captured and maintained on the item record. So the item is sort of like a superset of all of the information about the CAD file. It's all the CAD file stuff, plus maybe some additional information that you don't want to have on the CAD file. Right? And then one other interesting bit of functionality, change order functionality in Vault. It's another thing that a lot of Vault users do not use, but items have some very specific behaviors in the context of change orders. One of them is when you are adding records to a change order, the controlled records on a change order for items, they can have change specific properties. So a really good example would be disposition. What's going to happen to this part number, as a result of this change? Are we reworking existing stock? Are we scrapping it? Right? You can have those change order specific properties for items, but you cannot have them for files. And item states can be manipulated automatically when a change order is closed. With files, again, that doesn't happen as far as I know. So when I close my change order in Vault, the item state can automatically change, say, from review to released. So I don't have to remember to go back and set that final state. Items have categories, right? They have bills of material, right? It is actually called a bill of materials. We'll see some examples here in a little bit. And what's interesting about this bill of materials behavior is that the BOM can be extracted from the CAD file, from Inventor, from AutoCAD Electrical, from AutoCAD Mechanical, and even from some third-party tools like SolidWorks. We can extract the bill of materials from the CAD file into Vault Professional. And this is one of the most important reasons why you would want to use items when you're using Vault, is to separate that BOM data from the CAD file, to release it from being trapped inside that CAD file, and then manipulate it in some way, right? You could turn rows off if there was a file in the model that you didn't really, or a part number in the model that shouldn't be on the BOM, you can turn that row off. You can add rows to the BOM, right? Vault Professional lets you compare bills of material between revisions, which is something that you can't do in something like Inventor. You can export that data from Vault. For AutoCAD Electrical, that has some very interesting behavior where you can actually include tags and installation and location data in the bill of materials, which can be very, very important for assembly purposes. But what's very important, most important of all, is if the CAD file can still own the CAD portion of the BOM. So when you update the BOM in CAD and update your item in Vault, the CAD portion of the BOM updates, right? So you're not removing ownership of the BOM from the CAD file. That stays associated, right? And finally, another very interesting behavior of items in Vault is the ability to capture model states in a way that you can see those model states outside of CAD, right? If you're just looking at the file in the Vault, it's not clear if there are model states and what those model states might be, and maybe their extended properties. With Vault items, when you extract the item information or the part number information from an Inventor part or assembly, each model state can become an item record that is separate from the CAD file, but again, still linked to it. And we'll see examples of a lot of this here in just a minute. So that's an overview of what items are and what capabilities they have. There is a lot of capability there. Anyone who owns Vault Professional has access to that capability. And the vast majority of those of you watching right now, or at least while we're live at least, aren't using it at all, right? So if you have been looking for ways to switch to a more part number centric workflow in engineering to facilitate how you communicate data with the rest of the company, this is what you could get by using items. So how would you get there? Let's say you're using Vault today. Most of you on this that are watching live now probably are using Vault today. You're not using items. So if you wanted to start using items, you would need to transition, right? In my experience, most of our customers that are using Vault Professional are using revision control in some way, right? You're changing files from work to release and keeping track of revisions. If you're not doing so today, right? If you are not tracking revisions on your files in Vault today, and they're all just, especially if they're all just in the base category, I would strongly consider using items before you implement any sort of file lifecycle behavior, because it would be very straightforward for you to transition to items if you're not using any behaviors at all, right? So, but most organizations have many existing files with existing behaviors. Those files are already in life cycles. They're already in, they've already got revision history, et cetera, right? And then, if we're talking about extracting the bill of materials from CAD files into Vault, if your CAD BOM isn't in any state that you could use, that has any use to you outside of CAD, then, that's something to consider as well, right? So in order to get from file behaviors to item behaviors, you don't have to do it this way, but this is the way I would say the workflow works best, and this is the smoothest. Typically, you would want to remove any behaviors on the existing files. You might want to move the category to the base category. The item could carry the category that part or file should otherwise have, because we're talking about going from a file, right? And one interesting thing about categorization with Vault, and this is getting down a bit into the weeds of how Vault works, but with Vault, when you want to put a file into a category, the rules for categorizing files, you can set up rules. You can say, if this file has a property called category and its name is part, then put it in a part category. Or if this file ends in .ipt, put it in the part category. And if it ends in .iam, put it in the assembly category. So you can categorize files automatically. And I would say most vaults that are taking advantage of life cycles have those rules in place, but you can only automatically categorize when the file comes into the vault based on the information that is on the file when it comes into Vault. Otherwise, you have to use the change category command, and then you can reapply the rules if you want to, right? But in some cases, depending on what your workflow in Vault needs to be, it can be a little bit painful to get the files categorized automatically. You may not even necessarily know what category the file should be in the first time you check it into Vault. With items, you have, all the time in the world to get the file correct and its properties correct before you create an item from it. And then the item category can be based on any of the file properties. So, that's one way to get the right behavior on a record right out of the gate once you start applying behaviors, is to use items, right? So that's an interesting thing about categories and Vault. So again, when we're talking about transition, your file behavior needs to go away. That would be the category, and typically the life cycle definition and revision scheme would also go away. Again, it's easiest to use if the Vault item controls revision, file access, state, etc., right? And then once the behavior is removed from the file, you would assign the item. If it's something that has an existing revision history and you need to get the current revision level of the item, on the item, you can use change revision command and even use a file UDP to set that revision. And then you would, set the final lifecycle state. So, there's a bit of work involved in making that transition. But again, if you're not using Vault life cycles at all right now and you plan to start sometime soon, definitely rule out items. Take a good look at items, and then decide you don't want to use them before you start applying file-based behaviors. It'll just be an easier transition. If your workflow is typically project-based, like you create documents, you execute a project, and then you're done with it, and you typically don't touch that data again for a while or ever, then typically what you do is create items of your standard parts. The files can still participate in whatever method they need to in existing projects, whatever, right? And then when you start new projects, just go ahead and start, the item behavior with new projects going forward. When you are transitioning, it's often best to start with higher level assemblies, because that will let you create many items at once, right? Because when you assign an item to a file in Vault, it needs to build the bill of materials for that entire structure. So if I have an assembly that describes 1,000 pieces, and I want to create items of that, starting at a higher level, even potentially at the top, could end up with a lot of created items without a lot of clicking, right? And then for those situations where you may have, duplicate files in the Vault that describe, that have the same part number that kind of got scattered around, the item records are a way to sort of consolidate that data, because depending on how you configure your Vault, if you have two different CAD files that represent the same part number, whether they're actually different or if they're accidental copies, you would end up with only one part number in the item master, and both of those files would be linked to that one part number, right? So that's a way to sort of factor out some duplicates and even potentially expose some duplicates or help you understand duplicates, along with the duplicate search behavior in Vault can help with that too. But if you've got a lot of behaviors you need to change, like a ton of files and it's complex, if the change as you go isn't quite an option, you can use some bulk data migration tools that we could help you with here at Hagerman, some scripting to help change behaviors of things in Vault. So, if you're not sure, like if you really want to use items, but you're concerned about the difficulty of making this transition, we can talk, one-on-one to help you understand what it would take you to move to items and give you some recommendations on the best way to get there. So we've talked about what items are. We've talked a little bit about how you might go from, say, a file-based workflow to an item-based workflow. Let's talk about why you might want to do this, right? And before we get too deep into the why, we've got another poll question here, because I really would like to understand if any of you have already considered using the item master, but have ultimately decided not to do so, right? For those of you who have considered it, but said, no, that's not for us, there are some choices here, and I believe you should be able to pick as many of those choices as might make sense, right? Because there are reasons not to use the item master. Maybe it just seems like it's too complicated. Maybe you think it's too many clicks to manage revisions. Maybe you don't need that BOM behavior in Vault at all. Or maybe you just think you've got too much data to try to make the transition. So I'd like to get a sense of, again, for those of you who haven't decided to go with items, why not? We'll give it just a few more seconds here. We still have some votes coming in. I really appreciate everyone paying attention. I know I'm doing a lot of talking at you. I appreciate your attention and your participation in this. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up and let's take a look at this. And so this is about what I expected, extra clicks, but it does seem a little bit complicated, right? It's a little bit difficult maybe to get your mind wrapped around at first and what items are, but I think once you understand them and how they work, it's really just a bit of additional, very useful behavior on top of what you're already doing in Vault today. So if you're already managing files and file life cycles in Vault and have a good grasp of that, managing items is, I think, just a very small additional step for a lot of additional value. But I mean, I do see the vast majority of you have considered it, and a big hurdle is that existing migration. So in those situations, if you're, especially after this presentation, if you've got renewed interest in switching to items, we should talk and see what we can do about that. I mean, that's one of the things we specialize in here at Hagerman is, helping our customers achieve things that are otherwise pretty difficult to do. Right. So for those of you, especially that think they're still too complicated or too many extra clicks, right? Let's talk about that, right? So there's an extra record that you've got to maintain. Like why wouldn't we use items, right? If they do all these great things, why doesn't everybody use them, right? So they're extra clicks, and for years and years, I mean, I've been selling, and implementing Vault for literally 20 years at Hagerman, well before items were even existed in the concept of Vault, right? And they're extra clicks. If you don't need that other behavior, then it's extra clicks you just don't want to bother with. Some file types may still need to be maintained with file behaviors. Maybe some files don't make sense to have related to an item. So maybe some things are files and some things are items. You've got different workflows. You've got to update the item when your CAD file changes. The default jobs work only with file life cycles. And then depending on how the item master has been configured, the workflow might end up kind of confusing, right? But I think we can help with all of that, right? When it comes to the additional record, yes, it's an extra record, but there are lots of ways to represent a part number. There's lots of information associated with a part number. CAD files are only one representation of that part number. And that may be the only representation that people that use Vault care about. Maybe that's the only thing you need to worry about. In which case, maybe items, are too much work. But not all of the information about a part number is CAD centric, right? And most vaults that I've seen, there are often more than just the CAD file. When you've got a part number that you're managing information for, many vaults have more than just the CAD file and more than just a single CAD file that describe a part number. So the item is a great way to be able to easily combine all of that disparate file-based information into one record for easy access, right? And there are benefits to having multiple records describing a part number. The CAD file can be owned by the CAD folks. The item record can be owned by, a project manager or process control or something, right? So the CAD file, you just check in, check out, do your work, maybe update the item. But then when it comes to transitioning the item or maintaining some properties on that item, maybe someone else does that, right? And maybe they're doing that by hand or in some other system right now where it doesn't make as much sense, right? And even though you've got multiple records, it's very straightforward to navigate back and forth between. So if you're looking at a file that you think represents a part number, and when you want to go to the part number, one click can get you over to the item record. 2 clicks can get you back to the file record from the item, right? And these days you can even see the item and BOM data in Vault while you're in CAD, which would include any items that had been added to Vault afterwards, right? So now that additional record being around, yes, it's a little more work and it's a little more complication, but there is, in my mind, tremendous value for that complication, right? The extra workflows for other file types, a lot of times those files behave differently anyway. You've got work instructions that maybe just have, whip and release versus the CAD file that maybe has more states, right? And when you're talking about the process of how do I take a record from work to released, the clicks for items are the same as the clicks for files, right? It's just a different icon, essentially, that you're looking at. Item updates, that's one of the biggest issues that I see that people come up with is, I hate having to update the item when the CAD file changes, right? You can update an item in literally 2 clicks. You can update the item from your CAD application. And that also then allows you to iterate on the CAD file and make changes to the CAD file before you update the item. So in that situation where others are looking at the item or maintaining the item, you can do your CAD work and iterate as much as you want, and then eventually update the item to push those changes to the part number record, right? So again, that concept of updating, there's value even in the quote unquote having to do it. I think there's value in not doing it right away sometimes, right? And a hurdle that a lot of people don't think about, this is newer behavior in Vault where you can automatically create PDF, DXF, and step files. Out of the box, like the default behavior in Vault, you can only queue up those jobs against files when you're using file life cycles. And so the out of the box, that workflow can get a little bit complex, right? But you can design that workflow to minimize confusion, and some very common third-party software that we implement literally every day, Cool Orange Power Jobs, can remove that limitation entirely, in addition to giving you lots of other interesting behaviors, right? So beyond all of those common problems, right, there are other, and the reasons I think, yes, they are things to consider, but I think there are upsides or ways to overcome those limitations. The additional benefits, right? One of the biggest ones is getting your BOM data out of CAD, right? People can look at the BOM, they can review the BOM, they can add to the BOM without ever opening the CAD file, right? And you can unlock your model state data from CAD, right? We can capture both inventor model state information and SOLIDWORKS configurations, basically one CAD file that contains information about many part numbers, right? The Vault file, interface doesn't have a great way to explore all that, but Vault lets you do it. So here's a typical example where we've got an assembly, right? This is our original assembly here, and we've got options for different paint colors, let's say. A great way to capture those variations or variances using model states in Inventor, right? So our blue has a slightly different part number and a different description. Our green has a slightly different part number and different description, right? We can capture that data in CAD, but now how do we get that out of CAD into, 3 different part numbers that are almost identical, but maybe each have their own part number for the paint of that specific color, and different overall part number and different description, right? Well, in CAD, maybe you're exporting 3 different bills of material to Excel and then giving them the right name and then touching each spreadsheet to add the part number. But in Vault, what we can do is we can just assign item to that assembly, and it will automatically extract, just like that, the 3 distinct part numbers for the 3 distinct different colors. So our base, and then our blue variant, and our green variant with the correct description. Now these are 3 different records in the system that can now each have their bill of materials modified to add the correct color of paint, but they are all still linked back to the CAD file, right? So this to me is one of the best uses of items in Vault, is being able to quickly build out your bills of material for variants that you have captured in a single document with model states, right? Linking of files together, right? Things that I call alternate representations, right? So for hoses or tubes, let's say you've got a tube that you buy, it's got a part number, and you show that in 50 different possible configurations in your model. They all have the same part number. There are 50 different inventor part files to describe the 50 different pieces of geometry. You've got 50 files floating around, but it's all the same part number. You can combine all of those files onto one record and link them all together with that part number, so that you could quickly see, for this part number, here are all of the representations of that, right? And then, of course, all the non-CAD data, work instructions, cut sheets, quality plans, right? Now, if you're managing all of this stuff with files, you put in a part number and you can, up here at the top, and you're seeing all of these different things. It could be a step file, a PDF, even other model files that have no bearing on that. But if you put a part number in Vault, you see just the part numbers. And then underneath that, you can see all of the different related files, right? It's a nice clean container, which is nice, but we're used to, engineers are used to using Vault. They're used to complexity. When you get into people that don't use Vault every day, let's say they use the thin client, that's what we see right up here. When they put in a part number and they're looking for files, they're going to get this huge list of things, and maybe they can puzzle it out. You're asking somebody to, look for that part number with PDF. And, if you use CAD every day, it seems, oh, that's simple. You just do it. But there are people that don't sit in front of a computer all day, and that don't like computers at all. It can be challenging for them to sort through a list of things and find what they're after, right? So if you have an item-centric workflow, right, you can say, I want to search for items instead of files. And that same number, again, now you just have those 3 part numbers to pick from. And on that part number, now you have all of the relevant documents. So I know for that part number, this is exactly what it is I'm looking for, right? It's much easier for a lot of people that are not used to using, computers all day and big lists of files to get exactly what they need by just searching for a part number and getting that list of part numbers succinct. These are all of the part numbers. And if they type in the exact part number, they're only going to have one record, period. Right? And then finally, one of the biggest benefits in my mind, if you don't use something like model states and if you don't have a lot of files, is getting to a complete engineering bill of materials. Right? You can certainly do this in Inventor. By adding virtual components, right? You can add rows to a parts list on a drawing. You can export to a spreadsheet and type in and copy and paste and combine things, what have you, right? But Vault gives you much more capability to do this much faster. And you can combine the BOMs from different software more easily too, keeping all of the BOMs linked to each individual piece of software, AutoCAD Electrical, maybe a part model in SolidWorks, an assembly in Inventor. You need all of that to come together in one bill of materials, consolidated from engineering. You can do that with Vault while keeping those independent BOMs linked to the different format CAD files, right? So let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison. On the left here, we have how you might do this in Inventor to get to a complete engineering bill of materials. The goal here is I want to add one part to the BOM that I don't have a drawing for, in this case, Loctite. On the right side is how I would do it in Vault. So let's take a look at how we do it in Vault, right? I start from my CAD file. I go to my item, right? There's my part number for this. I can edit that item by opening it up, pressing the edit button, right? Edit is kind of like checking out the item, right? There's its bill of materials. I can edit, I can add a row to the BOM, and all I have to do is search. I know I want to add Loctite. I don't know what the part number is. I know it's Loctite red. There it is, it's on my list. I add it, and then if I need to, I can change the quantity, and I'm done, right? 40 seconds or so, and I have my BOM done in Vault. Now on the left side in Inventor, we're kind of even just getting started. I started out looking at the BOM and how am I going to do this? Is it a part? I need to make an empty part. I think I'll go with the virtual component route. So now I add the virtual component. Now I've got to come in here and I've got to give it its part number and description. I don't know what those are off the top of my head, right? So now I call up another system like Fusion Manage, put in the Loctite, search. I see essentially the same results, but now I'm copying and pasting part numbers and descriptions onto the virtual component. And eventually I get all of that in, then I can save my assembly and then I can export the bill of materials. And now after, more than a minute later, eventually I might have my BOM both complete and available outside of CAD. That's the other thing, right? With Vault Item Master, the BOM is available without any access to the CAD data. To get to that same spot in Inventor, I had to dig up part numbers, copy and paste, export the BOM, and now it's available outside of CAD, right? You know, it's almost a minute and a half later, right? And we're just now getting there, right? So if you need to use that workflow, if you're commonly adding little bits and pieces that you didn't draw, you need to get it on the BOM so it can get purchased or whatever, Vault can be a huge time saver, right? And then finally, some of those additional benefits beyond just, say, day-to-day CAD use, the ability to more easily integrate with ERP or PLM, right? Engineering, people that use CAD, it's very file-centric. I'm working on my CAD files. Where's my assembly file? Where's my drawing, right? File, file, file. Most of the rest of the business, unless you've got a drawing in hand because you're making something or reviewing, you're talking about part numbers. You know, a part number is going to go on a writer in the shop. It's going to go into the business system. It's going to go onto a customer order. A customer order comes in for a part number. It's part number, part number, part number. If your engineering management system has part number information inherently exposed outside of the CAD data, it is going to be easier for other systems to talk to it, right? You can also get your BOM sorted. If the goal is to send our BOM to some other business system, you can get the BOM sorted outside of CAD. You can do all of that in the Vault interface without having to crack open Inventor and open a 1,000-part assembly. It's just right there inside your Vault, right? And it makes it possible to push some updates back to CAD. So you can't update a CAD file BOM necessarily from a change to the BOM in Vault, but you can update property information. So if there's information owned by ERP, let's say, that you really need on the CAD file, ERP can send the data to the Vault item, and the next time the file gets opened, the item can push that property data down to, say, an Inventor I property, which can then land on a drawing, right? So again, data owned by some other place, it gets put in one time, it's correct, gets pushed all the way down to CAD eventually. And then if you've looked into PLM at all, Autodesk's solution for PLM, Fusion Manage, you can actually get that together with Vault. It's a product called Vault PLM. And any future integration between the two provided by Autodesk will almost certainly use Vault items as essentially the common language between the two. So if you're using Vault items, it will be likely much less expensive and complex for you to benefit from PLM capability using Vault PLM if you are using items in Vault. Right. So I got one more question here. I know we're getting a little bit short on time. I want to leave time for questions. We've got quite a few in the queue. So one more poll question. We're going to give it just a minute. I'm curious how you transfer for your BOM data from engineering to other business systems, say to ERP or MRP or PLM, right? The typical ones are, you go from CAD to ERP with some sort of plugin inside CAD, like CAD Link is one we hear about all the time, right? Or maybe you take your CAD data from Excel to CSV. Maybe you have some middleware in place already, like Cool Orange PowerGate, that takes your data from Vault, say, right to ERP. Maybe you're just spitting it out in Excel, or maybe even you're just like, okay, here's the drawing, here's the parts list, type it in, right? So we'll give it another 20 or 30 seconds so we've got time to answer questions. I'll say a very surprising number of you are still doing manual entry. Very surprising. I thought it would be lower than that because we've got a lot of people that at least, okay, the number's catching up a little bit. So let's go ahead and just share this quickly. Nearly half of you still sort of do just here's it on the drawing and, type it into ERP. Second, not surprising, basically we spit out to an Excel file or CSV, and then somebody uploads it, right? So if you are in, that group that are currently spitting out to Excel, using the Vault Item Master could prepare you very well for some sort of automated integration, right? And we talk to companies about this all the time, several times a week in my case. Everybody wants to do this. Everyone would love an easy button that says, when I got to give a BOM for my assembly to purchasing or whoever, process control, yes, give me a button and make it go, right? Because it increases productivity, reduces mistakes, lets you do more work with less people. It's so hard to find good people these days, right? But I would say most of the people we talk to aren't quite ready. Their engineering BOMs aren't complete. The BOMs are locked up in CAD, and it's not even necessarily understood who owns what data, right? And then, of course, that integration's got to pay for itself, right? There's a lot you can do with automation and software these days, but that capability comes with a price. And some configurations are easier to integrate with others, right? So if we look at this, our engineering data, we've got to get it over to ERP, right? It's largely the same data, it's just formatted a different way, right? But we have to transform this data to transfer it to our ERP system. The shape's got to match. And if you're just using files and your CAD BOM is locked up inside CAD, your engineering BOM isn't complete, it's extremely difficult sometimes to do this. Sometimes maybe it's not even possible, right? But if you use items, you get that engineering state much closer to the data structure that you need to get into ERP, right? And then it's much easier to transform that. This bit in the middle is where we have to take the data from Vault, transform it, and then put it in ERP. That transformation piece can sometimes be very simple. It can sometimes be very difficult. If you're using Vault items, it is likely going to be much easier, meaning lower total cost of ownership, faster implementation, better ease of use, everything, right? So more reliability, but also using items. Everybody likes to use CAD just a little bit differently. You do things a different way in your files or whatever. Maybe you even got some differences in the way, like different organizations, different businesses within the same company. They want to do their BOMs one way on their drawings. Another group wants to do things another way. The item master is both a way to maybe introduce a bit more consistency up front, but also have a target. The end result from engineering, no matter how it got there, is always your Vault items and your Vault item master, so that your integration can talk to that one same language, where you might have 50 different CAD files and 50 different templates with 50 different formats feeding the item master. They'll all end up as items the same way, right? So it's a great way to get, disparate engineering groups on the same page without necessarily forcing them to all work exactly the same way, right? You get better visibility. The data is outside the CAD file, lets you do some validation before you ship it to ERP. Reducing errors, reducing unnecessary transfer. And I'll say you get more options, right? Some third-party integration tools that I've seen only work with Vault items. And very recently here, Autodesk has provided some very great tools. There's now a REST API. The only way to get a BOM from Vault via the REST API is if you're using items. You could fetch the file, but now your system that's pulling the BOM has to now open the CAD file and interpret it. If you've got a BOM sitting there in Vault, you can make a REST API call to Vault. It's read only, just fetch the BOM and you're good to go. And like I said before, there's almost certainly some connectivity between Vault and Fusion Manage coming from Autodesk in the future. If and when that comes, it's almost certainly going to work with items, at least at first and probably ever, right? So if you've got a need for better workflow inside Vault, Vault's not quite meeting your needs, Vault PLM is the step you need to take to get that better workflow. If you're using items, you're going to be best positioned to take advantage of that integration that's probably coming. Right. So again, when we started, I said this is why you should use items. I think items are great. You get a part number-centric workflow to bridge that gap between CAD and the rest of the business. More options for organizing your data, more options for generating BOMs, and more options for integration. Just options, 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 right? In addition to the day-to-day improvements you might have, and just, maybe some operations being even faster, right? So if you need help with this, if you're new to Vault, if you're using Basic but not Pro, if you're using Vault Pro without items, or we can help, right? Just reach out to us. I'm sure our folks will be reaching out to you who have attended, especially if you provide on your survey that you'd like more information, and we'll help you in whatever way we can. Right. So now let's dig into the questions, and we've got quite a few. So first, is the item master the only way Vault Professional can support ERP such as SAP, or is it more focused on manufacturing capacity? So I will say the item master in Vault would make it easier to communicate with SAP. Again, it comes down to where is the BOM. Now, there are certain third-party tools that can extract the BOMs from Vault that are not itemized just yet, either digging into the CAD files or some behind-the-scenes API stuff. But that is all ends up more complicated, and you have to trust that the CAD BOM is correct and complete. The Vault Item Master can have that bill of materials outside CAD, so that it's easier to get to with integration software. Okay. Another question, how many extra clicks are there to revise an item versus just a file? I would say, thinking about it, if you're talking about just changing states, it's the same number of clicks. So if you're talking about a file, in both cases, you check the file out, you check the file in. So let's say 4 clicks. Now you right click and update item, that's 2 more clicks. And then you click one more time again, maybe, to save it. So we're talking about 3 more clicks. So 3 clicks instead of 10, and we're getting down into the actual clicks to revise something that is an item versus a file. Is there a benefit to using the generic item number as opposed to mapping the item number to the CAD part number? That's a great question. In my mind, in a perfect world, the CAD file would have a part number, the file name would match the part number, and that part number would be the same number as the item master number. Now, in certain situations, like I said, with alternate representations, you might have different CAD files that represent the same part number. And in that situation, you can have multiple files with the same part number and the same item number, and the files all stay linked together. So another question, what's the argument for using items when someone says they are already managing items in ERP? Seems redundant. Discrepancies between the two systems will be too difficult to manage. In my mind, if you're already managing items in ERP, everybody is if they have ERP, you've got to feed ERP from somewhere, right? Those items, those bills of material have to come from somewhere. The argument is, how do you feed ERP? I would argue the Vault Item Master gives you more options for how to feed ERP. So it also can let engineers stay and live in CAD and not have to manage things in ERP. One less system for them to worry about, and maybe fewer licenses of ERP if your ERP is licensed that way. Here's a great question. I only have my live Vault system and no sandbox. Is there any danger to trying out Item Master on a live Vault system? I would say no. I wouldn't try it out on your production files. If you create some files, you put them in the base category, you create items from them, you can try them out. If you don't like them, you can delete the items with no problem. You can leave them there and just turn off visibility of the behavior, no problem. So you can try out items without really any harm. How well would this integrate with a tool like CostPoint? I'm not sure what CostPoint is, but if there's a REST API or an API of some sort for CostPoint, items, and CostPoint is focused on part numbers, then Vault would definitely work better with with the item master and integration. Our ERP Visual 9 includes resources and tasks, and these be included through item masters. Yes, if you have resources and tasks, again, that's one place where the Vault item master, its hierarchical relationship, you could create quote unquote part numbers or items for the resources and tasks, add them to the item master, and then be transferred to Visual. So your items don't have to be related to CAD. They can be any number linked together. Cool Orange is pricey. Can you recommend alternatives? I would argue that Cool Orange is probably the best value you're going to get for what you need any given tool to do, largely because of ongoing maintenance. The way you can customize behaviors with the Cool Orange tools, when you upgrade from release to release, there's often little to no work necessary to make the behaviors work in the new release. That's partly why they're priced the way they are, but I think especially tools like Power Jobs are incredible value for what you get. Can you link item rev to pull from a file iProperty revision? The item rev, if you're applying system revisions to the item, you can use a file iProperty to do that. The rev property is still a system property, however, and so you can only change the revision of the item with the change revision command. But if you're trying to make the transition from rev to file rev to item rev, you can use properties to do that. Is there a way to rewatch this webinar? There will be a link available to watch it as many times as you want. Ashley will talk about that in just a second. Is the item master the only way to export out UDP from iProperties from highest level assembly? If from Vault, I would say yes. Outside of Vault, you would do that with a structured inventor BOM showing all levels. And another question, how well can this tool work with SolidWorks files? I think it works very well. You can extract bills of material from SolidWorks files, and then what's great about that is the items behave the same way as items that came from Inventor, or items that came from electrical, or items you created from scratch. They all behave the same way. Another question just came in. Do items enable better collection of child items for change orders? For example, new items being made, being missed from being added to a change order for release when used inside of a larger assembly. That's a great question. I would say items don't necessarily offer a unique benefit there. What you would want to do is configure your items lifecycle such that you cannot release an item if there are child items that are not already released or being released along with it. That's how you would prevent things from being missed, because you wouldn't be able to release the parent unless all the children were either released at the same time or already released. You could do the same thing with files, I would say. But that's the way to do that one. So, all right. I went through the questions very fast because we were very short on time. We had some great questions. I really appreciate it. But I think for now we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So back to you, Ashley.